The Afterwards, Section 9. Friday was a school day like the rest, and December stayed in class, stayed at school all the way through. She hadn't given up on happiness, though. It was just that now she had a better plan, or a better start of a plan. Possibly, so long as she didn't look at it too closely. That evening, Harry and Penny were going out. They had tickets to the theatre to see a long play about people sat in a room arguing about who was in love with who. The play had been a hit a few years earlier, but this was the first time it had been put on nearby, so they jumped at the opportunity. The tickets had been pinned to the corkboard in the kitchen, and the date had been circled on the calendar for ages. Despite all that, Harry had sat down with her at breakfast and said, "Ember, if you don't want us to go, we won't. If you want me to stay with you tonight, I will." He was a good man. She knew that, and he really wouldn't have minded if she'd said, "Stay here." He was really very sweet. But as it happened, she didn't want him to stay. Her plan needed him to go. His mum and dad, Tilda and Pork Pie, her gran and grandad were going to be babysitting, even though she wasn't a baby, and that was going to give her all the opportunity she needed. Tilda and Pork Pie weren't like most grans and granddads she knew of. They were old people made more like teenagers. Ember wasn't sure what had gone wrong with them, but they'd failed to grow up properly. After they'd hustled her upstairs, "I'll read for a bit, then I'll go to bed," she'd told them. They put popcorn in the microwave and snuggled up on the sofa to watch a movie they'd brought over. 6 months earlier, Ember had come downstairs to get a glass of water or something, and had found them ignoring the movie entirely while cuddling and giggling and snogging. It had been absolutely horrible. They hadn't noticed her, and they'd snuck back upstairs. And she'd snuck back upstairs, embarrassed, surprised, and feeling ever so slightly sick. It had been bad enough when she'd interrupted Harry and Penny, but at least they weren't really old and married and didn't smell of talcum powder, and at least they'd been embarrassed. Tilda and Pork Pie had been together for decades, so quite why were they still so lovey-dovey she couldn't imagine. She didn't want to ask. She just knew Pork Pie would say something excruciating like, "Whoa, but if I don't half fancy your gran, something rotten, love." Because that was how he spoke, embarrassingly. But still, she sort of liked them, and they could be fun to go and stay at Christmas with. And most importantly, they fitted perfectly with her plan for tonight. 20 minutes after they'd started their film, Ember slipped silently down the stairs, dressed and in her coat, and under cover of explosions roaring out of the TV and kisses spilling from the settee, crept out the front door, popping Harry's spare keys into her pocket. She felt amazing. She was buzzing. She walked through the streetlight-lit streets, as if she did this every evening, head up, confident. There were teenagers on bikes outside the newsagents. A bus passed by, an illuminated room gliding down the road. The air was cold and there were a few speckles of rain on it. She slipped into the alley behind Uncle Graham's house and pulled the map from her pocket. Was it going to work? Was just holding the map enough to make the corners appear for her to go round? Or were there other rules? She stood in the alley and it looked perfectly normal. A dead end at one end, the way out to the street at the other. Even shutting her eyes and opening them again, even turning around and then turning back, didn't change it. The map chilled her skin, like holding a box of fish fingers straight from the freezer. She turned the handle on Uncle Graham's gate. Maybe the map would only work its magic if she started from where she'd started before. From that back garden, by walking through that gate. She pushed it open carefully and peered around. The kitchen light wasn't on, but one of the upstairs lights was. A shadow was moving about in the room up there. The garden was dark, and she didn't think whoever was there, presumably her uncle, but you never knew, would see her, not if she was quick. She took a couple of steps onto the mud that should have been a lawn and took a deep breath. Pause. Then she turned round and took a couple of steps back to the gate and went through it into the alley. The map shivered in her hands like a kitten beginning to purr in its sleep. She turned left and, yes! Ahead of her was the junction. She ran round the corner and then round the next one and the next, her heart keeping steady in the same way a girl walking a tightrope does, arms wide, eyes shut. As she passed the fourth corner, she wondered where the cat was. It had normally seen her by now, normally made a comment of one sort or another, but not today. In a way, she felt relieved. It would only have tried to talk her out of this again, but at the same time she half missed it. It seemed to be on her side more so than anyone else, even if it didn't agree with her plans. But it wasn't there today. Round the next corner and she pushed her uncle's gate open for the second time in a couple of minutes, and there she was back in the life-leached black and white world, dusty and drear. It looked to be the same grey early evening it always was there. She stepped from the darkening alley into thin, insipid daylight. The back door was shut, but not locked this time. Was that how she'd left it? As she tiptoed through the empty house, she remembered with a shiver what Ness had said. There's something in there. The rustling, shifting sound she had heard before didn't come again. There was a faint crackle in the air, but all else was silence. She hurried on. She wedged the front door with the umbrellas and walking sticks in as before, and she froze. A bumblebee battered itself against the window of her chest. She was filled with a sudden fear, a sudden flood of uncertainty. Get Ness, she told herself. Get Ness and get out of here. But standing in the hallway, about to go into the world, she felt like she was being watched. The stairs reared up beside her. Was there someone up there? And then, a noise from the front room. Something shifting, something settling in place. No footsteps, no voice. A humming though, a hint of someone singing to themselves inside their head, and a faint, distant crackle in the air all around her. Without turning to look, she jumped out into daylight, into the disappointing grey sunshine. Ness wasn't in the front garden, wasn't waiting in the street for her, but nor was Miss Todd. So Ember turned left and headed off to their own houses. Only once walking those empty streets did she see anything moving. As she passed the school, something looked across the playing fields. It was a squirrel, a dead squirrel, bouncing over towards the trees. It saw her as she saw it and froze in place. It looked at her, clutching its tail to its chest like an embarrassed woman with a handbag. Hello, she said. It didn't reply, but after having judged her to be no rival for ghost nuts or phantom acorns or whatever squirrels ate in that dead world, it sprang off, bouncing across the field until it reached the tree and wrapped itself around the trunk in spiraling loops, right up into the branches and out of sight. So, she thought, squirrels remember themselves longer than snails. She didn't know what she would do with this information, but she stored it away, like an acorn. What the scientists or psychologists would have given, she thought years later, looking back to be able to come here and make a study of which animals hung around longest, which had the greatest of self-consciousness. But she wasn't a psychologist or a scientist. Not yet. Soon she was stood outside Happiness's house yet again. Happiness was back in her doorstep, back in place as if she'd never moved. Did she look even fainter, even greyer, even more washed out than before? Maybe. It was hard to say. From the very first time December had found her here, she'd been grey and washed out. Was she fading, or just waiting for a switch to flick from echoing to silence? The snail had been there and then vanished. The robin too. It was this place. It sucked the joy out of you. Ember hoped that taking Ness back to the real world would fill her up with life and light and energy again. Everything that made Ness, Ness. Dick? Ness said quickly without much surprise. Thought it was you. I said I'd be back, Ember said, and she found that her voice wobbled halfway through the last word, choked in her throat. She felt her eyes growing misty. I said I'd come back, she tried again. Thank you, said Ness. She stood up slowly, climbing to her feet like it was a great effort. We're going to have to be quick, Ember said. We're going back the way we went before. But this time we won't get... Won't get what? Caught, said Ember, as she turned to look at Miss Todd. Ah, said the woman. She wasn't smiling anymore. You shouldn't be here. I've warned you, and saved you, and sent you home. I'm warned you again, but you insist on coming back. Of course I keep coming back, Ember said. How can I leave her here? She pointed at Happiness. She's my best friend. This is what friends do. Miss Todd gave Ness barely a glance as she spoke. It's not anything. There are no friends here. This isn't that sort of place, December, my dear girl. That business is all over the moment you step through my gates. No, said Ember. She was bubbling inside, boiling like a kettle. No, that's not true. She's my friend, here, there and everywhere, anywhere. That don't change. Miss Todd dismissed her with a wave of her hand. I can't be your protector anymore. I'm busy. We're done. It's over. I'm sorry. She snapped her fingers, turned on her heel, and strode away up the street. Ember shivered. She'd been ignored, left as if she didn't matter. It felt odd. She felt odd. Then she happened to look up, and across the street she saw the net curtain fall back into place as Mrs. Melrose stepped away from the window. How long had she been watching? Ember wondered, and then she went to glance at her watch, and she stopped. Her heart stopped in her chest. Her breath stopped in her throat. Her mind stopped thinking. Thoughts drifted to the ground like snow and lay unmoving around her feet. Her watch, her wrist, her hand, her sleeve, her fingers were all drained of colour. She was black and white. She was shades of grey. She was like Ness, like the world. She was dead.